I've been looking at a lot of old pictures of American cities. I'm trying to understand how our once great cities have transformed over the last 100 years. And some of these pictures are honestly quite disheartening. Like, look at this one. This is Springfield, Illinois in the 1930s. And this is it today. Notice the loss of density, the loss of infrastructure. Okay, but check out this one. This is an image of Providence, Rhode Island in the 1900s. Again, notice the density. Notice the architecture, the greenery, the urban landscape. This is that same area today. This pattern of our cities being completely transformed, or honestly demolished, repeats across the United States. There are many reasons for this evolution in American cities, from politics to change in industry to socioeconomic disparities and to honestly blunt racism. But probably nothing has had as unified of an impact on the American urban landscape as the automobile. The automobile was ultimately what gave cities the ability to be carved out like this. In this episode, let's take a look at how American cities and roads have been created and destroyed, and how our collective decisions and obsession with the automobile have forever broken and changed American cities. As usual, for more urbanist content, remember to like and subscribe. Follow us on Threads and Instagram for channel updates and more content. And if you really like this video and this channel, consider supporting us with that super thanks button down below. All right, let's turn back the clock.
Dangerous cycle.
Tonight is science.
Beauty inspired by the...
It's the turn of the 20th century in the United States, and cities are booming, and transportation is primarily dominated by the streetcar. Streetcars were ubiquitous and frequent, with wait times averaging only 90 seconds in some major cities. Downtowns across the United States had their streets lined with rail and electric lines to power the streetcars. New York City, Boston, Atlanta, you name it, every major city in the United States had a streetcar. Even sprawled out cities like Los Angeles had a huge rail network that connected Southern California. For a long time, the biggest problem was that there weren't enough streetcars. However, as we approach the 20th century, a poison pill is brewing in the streets of major cities. The wealthy elite in American society started investing into the quickly proliferating automobile. And for a long time this was fine and inconsequential to overall traffic. Well, it wasn't actually totally fine. The US actually saw a rampant increase of deaths relating to car crashes at first. Massive protests were started across American cities in order to implement speed limits. Newspapers criticized the technology and published propaganda against it. So it wasn't actually fine, but that's a topic for another video. So if you'd like to learn how anti-car America was at some point, leave a comment down below. But in regards to the streetcar, it was fine, at first. However, as the number of cars grew, the battle for the streets became more chaotic. Streets that were initially made for pedestrian, carriages, streetcars, and bicycles now had speeding and accelerating automobiles on them. The roads were getting crammed. As more people started to buy the automobile, the streets got more congested. Certain stop signs and intersection laws were lifted for the car, and overall the streetcar started to be treated as a second-class citizen on the roads in the United States. As the streetcar started to travel slower and slower, everyday average people made a choice, and one by one, people stopped using the streetcar and opted for a brand new automobile. The cycle of congestion had now begun. As more and more people bought into the automobile, the streetcar started to lose ridership. And with a loss of ridership, they lost revenue. To combat the loss of ridership, streetcars tried to raise fares. However, many local governments had gotten used to the streetcar only costing a nickel and prevented fares from increasing. This didn't change the fact that many streetcar employees wanted to be paid more with the increased inflation, and electric companies were asking for more money to provide the energy for streetcars. All of this led to one thing and one thing only. The streetcars went broke. It's somewhat well known what happened afterwards. In some cities across the United States, car companies disguised as bus companies started buying up the streetcars and slowly replacing the rails with buses.
The inflexible rails, permanently embedded in cobblestones, were paved over.
However, it's often exaggerated how much this contributed to the collapse of the streetcar. By the time these streetcars were being bought by these bus companies, they were already in big financial trouble. While these car companies were happy to have the streetcar gone, the demise of the streetcar ultimately came from car congestion and the collective decision of average Americans to choose individualism and further buy into the car. However, it did not stop there. As existing roadways started to get clogged with more and more cars and road repairs, planners attempted to alleviate congestion by expanding previously underdeveloped city routes into arterial boulevards. Several major boulevards that I've explored in previous episodes were upgraded during this time, forever defining their neighborhoods and cities. Olympic Boulevard was expanded into a 100-foot wide road in the 1920s, kicking off a series of legal battles and destroying developed property in the process. Wilshire Boulevard was donated by Henry Wilshire to the city of Los Angeles under the condition that it would never support rail infrastructure. The completion of this boulevard left a permanent scar in what is today MacArthur Park. Back on the East Coast, we started seeing the abandonment of streetcar lines and the expansion of other major boulevards as well. Moving into the 1950s, we saw McGinnis Boulevard, formerly known as Oakland Street, upgraded into an arterial boulevard from a local street road. Yet for every streetcar line removed and every arterial boulevard created, planners kept running into the same problem over and over again: congestion. From this constant dilemma rose the concrete dreamers and the roadway maximalists. As we move into the middle of the 20th century, we start seeing some of the first freeways and highways being built in the United States. In Detroit, the automotive capital of the United States at the time, we see the construction of the first freeway in the form of the Davison Freeway. In Los Angeles, the Arroyo Seco Parkway opened up as the city's first freeway. But the highway boom didn't really kick off until the post-war era, when President Eisenhower passed the Federal Highway Act of 1956. This act dedicated $25 billion in federal highway spending spread over the course of 10 years. But as highway construction spurred, a new phenomenon started to appear. New housing developments started to spring up around the entrances and exits of these federal highways. Furthermore, these new housing developments were sponsored by federally subsidized mortgages, making them lucrative for those that could afford the house and a car. At the time, this really only entailed people in the white demographic. And so began the era of white flight. With each new suburban development completing, more and more people started to flee urban centers for the suburbs. However, as people started to leave, cities started to panic. Places like Detroit started to lose revenue from taxes. In response, Detroit did two things. First, they raised taxes, which only caused people to want to leave more. And secondly, they started to build more highways in the hopes that this would bring more people into the city center. The belief was that building more roads would reduce congestion and invite more people from the suburbs to shop into the city centers. However, it did the exact opposite. More roads and more highways led to more suburban development, which led to even fewer people going into the city. And cities like Detroit continued this cycle. More highways were built into the city center, existing roads were expanded, entire buildings were demolished in order to expand parking space.
A good parking space is any space close enough.
And swaths of people relocated into poorer areas, which at the time primarily encompassed people from the black demographic.
Chicago is moving a city to build an 8-mile-long expressway.
But none of this rejuvenated the city. In fact, it made matters worse. Cities became more hostile, jobs were destroyed, walkable city centers were removed, and the streets became less and less safe as drivers sped through them at fast speeds.
Crime haunts the streets of the industrial city.
While in Detroit, these poor urban planning decisions were fostered by fear of economic loss, some cities in America decided to intentionally implement segregationist design in their cities. In Atlanta, we saw the construction of the Downtown Connector, a highway that quite literally was designed to split the city in two and act as a wall between white and black communities. The engineers in Atlanta hoped by creating segregation by design, they could avoid white flight from the city. While this partially worked, Atlanta still saw massive suburban development as the highways facilitated property development on the outskirts of the cities. And of course, what kind of episode would this be if I didn't mention the crooked king of highway design himself, Robert Moses?
Robert Moses, New York City construction coordinator, is a world-famous highway planner, a man who knows his business.
Bobby over here decided to destroy large swaths of New York City, displacing hundreds of thousands of people to construct massive roadways in New York City. He was responsible for the construction of the BQE in Brooklyn, which has caused many problems since it began its congestion peak. Many of his roadways were also motivated by segregationist design. When designing roadways to beaches in Long Island, he intentionally designed overpasses to be too low for buses to be able to travel through. This was motivated by the fact that primarily black individuals took public transit at this point. As we approach the present day, many American cities are starting to grapple with the damage that car infrastructure caused to them. Some cities continue to expand their roadways and highways, such as Miami and Houston, hoping that one more lane will ease congestion once and for all. However, I can guarantee you, if history has taught us anything, this is not the case. How many times do we have to go through this cycle? When pedestrians got in our way, we told them to stand on the side of the road. When the road rules slowed down vehicles, we got rid of them. When people got off streetcars and started driving their own vehicle, they blamed the streetcar for being too slow. Once we got rid of all the streetcars and expanded boulevards, we still said that the cities were too narrow and congested. When we tore through our cities with highways, destroying property and leaving neighborhoods impoverished and polluted, we blamed the cities for being crime-ridden and dirty. It's time to take a cold hard look in the mirror and recognize that the problem is the car. And unless you plan to stop expanding the human population or cover every acre of land on Earth with concrete, the car is simply not a scalable and sustainable mode of transportation. It's important to note that I glossed over a lot of nuance in today's episode. It's not easy to fit over 100 years of transportation history into a 10-minute video. For example, while the United States did have a sprawling streetcar system, it was far from perfect, and the companies running them often were not the most scrupulous. Furthermore, I cannot emphasize enough how much suburbanization was influenced by segregation. One could honestly argue that the car was just a tool that facilitated this segregation. If you'd like to learn more about how the car impacted US cities, I recommend reading Carmageddon by Daniel Knowles, which heavily inspired today's episode. In it, Knowles goes into way more detail about some of the topics that I covered in this video. I plan to do more videos on this topic of looking at how the car impacted specific cities in the United States. If you have a city in mind, make sure to leave it in the comment below, and I'll consider it for a future episode. Next week's episode will be a much overdue episode where I respond to comments across my YouTube videos. So if you have any questions or comments, make sure to leave them down below. As always, remember to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this content. And until next time, remember to keep on walking, or biking, or taking public transit, or whatever sustainable method you use to get around. Until next time.